Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today's is a good one. I've got several different tips for you to help you save some money. Right now, with inflation as well as just an overall increase in all prices, not just in the fishing industry, but you go to the grocery store, you're spending a bunch more than you used to spend for the same amount of food. But the tackle industry and the fishing world is exactly the same. We're seeing increases in lure costs, increases in terminal tackle costs, fishing line, rods and reels, boats, whatever it is that you're using to catch fish, probably costs a lot more now than it did just a few years ago. So anything we can do to save a few dollars, in my opinion, not only is good for your wallet, but also helps you just kind of down the road, maybe helps relieve some stress. And even though these tips feel small, over the course of the year, they will actually add up to saving some pretty significant amount of money. Especially the more you fish, the more you're going to save. So I've got a variety of tips here. Some that have more to do with your processes, some that have to do with actual baits. The point here is this is just a handful of different ways to save some money. So I'm going to challenge you guys if you have other ideas to help save a few bucks, put that in the comment section so that we can learn from you guys as well. And for those of us who are out there fishing that don't have the financial means to fish, any little tip or any way for them to save money just gets them back out fishing even faster. So that's what this channel is all about. We're trying to help people catch fish. And I want to point out, even though there's always a stress on having the most high tech and cool things in the fishing industry, there is no correlation, zero correlation here, guys, between how much money you spend and how many fish you're going to catch. The reality is this sport is all based on experience. And if you know where to go and catch the fish, you can catch the fish on a 50-cent bait or you can catch them on a $100 bait. It's up to us as to what bait we want to choose. But there really is not much correlation between, how much money you spend and how many fish you're going to catch. So, having said that, I do want to share these tips with you guys. And like I said, I'm going to challenge the rest of you to share one or two tips so that we can learn from you guys as well. So the first couple things I'm going to point out here, and I'm going to add that I've probably talked about a lot of these on the channel before, just kind of built into videos, but I figured I'd put them into one video so they're all into one place. And there's a lot more out there. If you like this, I will go ahead and do more of these types of videos, but I figured I would start with this one. So let's talk about our fishing line. Fishing line is something that we're seeing really go up in price with the different types of fishing line that have come out over the years. For a while we just kind of had our Berkeley trilene monofilaments, right? And you could buy monofilament line for relatively cheap, but then we started seeing copolymers and fluorocarbon and high-end braided lines coming out, and it's gotten quite a bit more expensive. So there's two things I really want to point out with fishing line. The first has to do with when you spool up your fishing reel. In reality, you're probably only using the back half of your spool or the top half, however you want to say it, of your fishing line. The rest of your line is going to basically be backing on your spool. So because of that, if you're putting 150 yards of line on and you're only really using 75 yards, you need to recognize that that first 75 yards at that point is basically a waste. Meaning, if you put 150 yards of brand new line on, you're only going to use half of that. So, what you should do is not put 150 yards of new line on. You should leave roughly 75 yards, or in my opinion, about half of your spool should be used old line. I've got backing on my reels that is probably, I'm going to say, 10 years old at this point. There is literally no reason to take it off because all I'm using it for is to bulk up my spool so that I can fill my spool with the line that I'm actually going to use. So you can drastically elongate the life of a spool of line that you have, because if you buy a 300-yard spool and instead of putting 150 yards on and getting two fills, if you're doing 75 yards, you're actually getting about four fills out of that same spool. And that's all based on not putting new line is backing on your reel. There is really no point to it. I've actually wondered why fishing reel manufacturers don't come out with really wide spools to the point where you're only putting on the line that you're going to use. It's always been a question of mine. But the reality here is that's a really good way to save some money and allow your line to last a lot longer. The other line tip that I would give you has to do with braided line. Braided line is one of those things that pretty much lasts as long as it's not used. Meaning, if you're using it, yeah, you'll go through it, it starts to fray. But a lot of times, for me specifically, if I'm using braid, I'm probably doing a lot of flipping with it. Well, if I'm flipping, my casts are probably, I'm gonna say no more than 50 feet, right? Like you're flipping down the bank, you're using just a short amount of line. So what you can do with that is if you want to spool up another reel with braided line, take the used braided line you have and reel that directly onto the new reel that you want to use. And what happens is the frayed braided line goes on your reel first, and therefore when you reel the rest of your braided line off and get to your backing, at that point you've got the braided line that you haven't used at all, and you've got fresh, good braided line to use. It's a really good way to make sure that you're using all of your braided line and you're maximizing, the shelf life of it. But it's something that's a simple tip. You literally reel it from one reel to the other reel, but because you started with the old line first, that goes on to be the backing of your new reel, and then you've got your fresh new braid that was towards the backing on your older reel. So that's the second tip. So fishing line is just one of those things that, there's a lot of other tips that we can talk about with respect to reducing line twist and trying to prevent nicks, but there's a lot of different things. But you need to recognize that fishing line is one of the more expensive things out there. And if you're not taking good care of it or maximizing the shelf life of it, it can get really expensive. Because as we all know, we've probably been there where you've made a cast and you've gotten a backlash on a brand new spool of line, and it ends up being a backlash you can't get out. And you're like, I just wasted 20 bucks worth of fishing line on one cast. So something to keep in mind. So those are a couple of tips. The next have to do with reusing some of your tackle, trying to make your tackle last longer. And what I mean by that is, this is a spinner bait that I found hanging in a tree this summer. So I don't know what type of abuse it's been through. It's not in necessarily great shape. The hook is kind of rusted on it. So ideally, I think most people would probably take this. You can see it's kind of bent out of shape. So I don't know. I don't want to put specifically a spinner bait. I don't want to tie on because I don't know what type of abuse it's been. I don't want to hook a fish and have the wire break on me, which happens after they've been beaten up. But so I think a lot of people would pluck this out of the tree and probably just throw it in the garbage. I'm not going to do that. Now, I'm not going to use this spinner bait, but what I will do with it is I will cut all of the components off. And then I save all the components, and then I can use them for future things. Maybe, the blades are still in great shape. The swivel, if you spin the swivel, is still in great shape. I mean, it's just one of those things where there's still a lot of very good components on here. There's no reason to throw them out. The beads I can use, the clevises, the swivel, they're all different things that I can use for uh, future bait rigging. So, I mean, like the little willow blade. A lot of people like to attach a willow leaf blade to the back of a soft stick bait. This would be perfect for that. Or I could go buy a pack of 5 small willow leaf blades for $5. So in this case, I might as well save that dollar and just attach that willow leaf blade and keep the components because I never know what I'm going to use them for. The point here is you can reuse a lot of stuff. On the channel before, I've talked about reusing bobber stops even. And I know that sounds small, like they only cost a couple cents, but there are so many things I can do with bobber stops that it's pretty ridiculous. I'll attach that video at the end of this if you guys want to watch a video about reusing bobber stops. But the point here is don't be afraid to salvage the parts that you can. I do the same with broken fishing rods. I take all the guides off and I'll reuse the guides for future builds if they're still salvageable. So don't be afraid to use that type of stuff. I mean, I can't tell you how often I'll pull you snag somebody's fishing line, you pull it up, and it's a big trot line of like lead and hooks, and it's a bunch of garbage. I'll take that lead. I've got a big bucket. I throw the lead in, and then I melt that down to pour my own jigs. So I reuse the lead. So the point here is you can salvage a bunch of stuff. And if you don't want to salvage it, that's fine. But the last point I made leads me into another one. You can make your own tackle. It is really a lot easier making tackle and fishing rods than you would expect, and it will save you a bunch of money. You can go out and buy a lead pot for relatively cheap, $50 to $100, depending on the size that you want. You can go out buy 100 packs of hooks. You can pour your own jig heads for 10 to 30 cents each, depending on the hooks that you purchase. You can make all your own drop shot weights. You can do all of that at a fraction of the cost of going out and buying it. Now, I realize you got to have the time to do it and you got to be willing to do it. And there's a little bit of an investment in terms of buying the equipment to make your own stuff, but you can do it. Same thing with fishing rods. I've talked about it lots on the channel. I build high-end fishing rods for about half of the cost that would be to go buy a same quality rod at retail. So for the initial, if it's a $400 retail rod, I can build it for about 200 bucks, and it costs you about 200 bucks in getting all of your rod building supplies that you'll have forever at that point. So instead of buying a retail rod, I can build the same rod, and then I have all my supplies for future purchases. The point here is if you truly want to save a few bucks, making your own tackle is one of the best ways to do it. And you don't have to just go out and buy a lead pot or buy the rod building stuff. You can do other things. If you want to make your own skirts for jigs, you can go buy pre-made jig heads and then make your own skirts. I mean, my little boy Hank, who's 6, is building skirts every day just because it's like arts and crafts class in the basement bait shop. But the point here is if he can do it, you guys can do it. And there is pretty much there's one little skirt making tool that you need that I think costs $3. So you can make the skirts for a fraction of the cost of going out and buying the skirts, or you can make your jigs if you buy pre-made jig head and then put your skirt onto it. Just lots of ways to save money. I don't really want to harp on that a whole ton, but the reality is here you can go out and make save a bunch of money by making your own tackle. And then there's other things, like I was talking about reusing baits is examples of that. If you've got a used up cut tail worm here, I could cut off the top 2 inches of this and make a Ned rig out of it. Now, is it the most ideal Ned rig out there? Probably not. But if I'm looking to save money and I've got a worm that's fully used up, I could reuse parts of that. Going back to the reusing plastics, there's a lot of people out there that melt plastics down and then re-pour plastics. Now, they may not have the most ideal colors, but the reality is they're able to do it. But then, you got to also look at tips and ways to save baits. This is one of my favorites. When people are throwing swim baits, oftentimes what happens is the tail comes around and hooks the hook, and then you get a split in it like that. Hopefully you guys can see it. And if you have a split in the tail, you lose your wiggle out of it. Like the water displacement coming over it just changes, and a lot of time you get a tail that just goes like this and it does not wiggle. But you can bring that back by getting rid of that cut. You just need to make, a similar cut on both sides of your bait. Now, I'm not going to have the exact same action, but by getting rid of that cut, I have you'll get a very good kicking motion out of it because both sides are even again. It'll be a little bit more of a finesse wiggle, but it's a usable bait. A lot of people, when that cut happens in there, they just cut it out, throw it away, and pull out a new one. In this case, I've just brought it back to being basically brand new again. So the point here is there's a lot of different ways that you can salvage fishing tackle and reapply it in other means. Just one of those things that I think oftentimes our first action is to go to throw something in the garbage. And in reality, there's a bunch of other ways to bring it back to use and save a few bucks while we're doing it. So I want to know from you guys, what do you have that can save us a few bucks? I'd love to know for my own personal, usage. And I think there's a lot of other viewers out that would like to learn from you guys as well. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.